proudly presents Ragged Revolution here on A&E.
I'm Edward Herman for the A&E Cable Network. Welcome to Our Century. In 1910, 7 years before the Russian Revolution, the poor and the oppressed of Mexico rose up and made the first revolution of the 20th century. For 10 years, various rebel armies marched across Mexico, providing a succession of temporary heroes who brought the people first hope and then disillusionment. More than 1 million people were killed, almost 1 out of every 15 people in Mexico. By 1920, when the bloodletting had finally exhausted the nation, Álvaro Obregón came to power. He, at last, brought the Mexican people together to create the true beginning of the Mexican state. Join us now for this documentary featuring some remarkable footage of this, the Ragged Revolution.
By 1920, the century's first successful revolution was all but over. Liberated at last from a succession of corrupt dictators, the Mexican people awaited the bright promise of a rebellion surpassed only by the Spanish Civil War for its cruelty and bitterness. Their new president, Álvaro Obregón, was genial and democratic. He set about the task of reconstructing his ruined land and creating for himself a place in history. His country was nearly 90% illiterate. Culture, like the economy, was in ruins. Poets and painters, visionaries and teachers joined Obregón's crusade. The revolution had promised so much. Now the government had to deliver. And it did. Amid the scaffolding of new government buildings, schools and a university, painters were at work. An idea from the new Minister of Education had inspired Diego Rivera, who quickly adopted it, an attempt to tie art to the revolution, the revival of a Mexican Indian tradition. Frescoes, paintings on the walls of public buildings that everybody could share. Soon, painters from far and wide followed Rivera's example. Orozco, Sigueras, O'Higgins, until Mexico led the world in mural painting. Over a period of 30 years, a fantasy of color spread like some beautiful fungus from floor to ceiling, from pillared archway to corridor's end, climbing round the windows, over the doorways, up the stairs. Most prolific was Rivera himself. One series of frescoes alone covered 17,000 square feet, the equivalent of a painting 1 foot high, 3 miles long. Surely an outburst of patriotic exuberance unsurpassed in the history of paint. Rivera exulted in the revolution. The revolutionary spirit overwhelmed him. In painting after painting, he glorified forever the history of his people and the triumph of their self-liberation. But Rivera didn't experience its grim pageant of savagery. Orozco did, and his murals reflect the horrors he saw. Mexico, September 1910. The capital city was playing host to the embassies of the world. A magnificent spectacle marked 100 years of independence from the rule of Spain. Visiting delegates vied with one another in extolling the virtues of the Diaz regime. General Porfirio Diaz, president of Mexico, seemed at the pinnacle of success. He was 80 years old and about to embark on his 8th term of office. He had been dictator of his country for 34 years. When Diaz came to power, Mexico had suffered 36 dictatorships since independence. Then, above all, the country needed peace. This Diaz had brought them, but at far too high a price. Mexico is the 8th largest country in the world. In shape, it resembles a horn of plenty. Mexicans cynically observed that the open end of the cornucopia tipped its treasure into the United States. Diaz remarked, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so near America." But it was Diaz who encouraged the flow of foreign capital into his country, so that by 1910, most of the oil and mining interests, the sugar and coffee plantations, the factories and the railways were enriching foreign investors at the expense of the Mexican people. They continued to live in squalor and ignorance. A historian wrote, "What use was it that 200 million pieces of mail flowed through the National Post Office annually when the peons could neither read nor write?" The gulf between rich and poor widened. Wages had remained stagnant for 100 years, but the cost of living had risen 400%. Under Diaz, the peasants were slowly starving. Hungry and apathetic, the sullen majority was no threat to his dictatorship. Yet. In 1909, President Taft of the United States paid a visit to Diaz. His was the country that held by far the biggest stake in Mexico. "I sincerely hope that Porfirio Diaz's life will extend beyond mine," he wrote to his wife. "We have $2 billion of American capital here that will be greatly endangered if Diaz were to die and his government go to pieces." The leaders met in the middle of the international bridge over the Rio Grande, which separates Mexico from the United States. Diaz, surrounded by the ornate trappings of his regime, put Taft to shame. "I feel quite outshone," he said. Diaz hoped that his countrymen would note well his friendship with Taft. "It strengthens him with his own people," Taft observed, wrongly, "and will discourage revolutionist efforts to establish a different government." Private meetings did not go well, and the display of cordiality of accord had perhaps come too late to be of any purpose. For by the independence celebrations of 1910, Diaz was on the brink of a precipice. He had a slogan, "Pan or palo," bread or the stick. It was the way he ruled, a skillful blend of favoritism and force. He bought loyalty by gifts, usually large estates, by concessions or cash. Those that refused his bread, he killed or imprisoned. He made the bandit the symbol of authority. The Guardia Rurales who paraded before him had once been bandits. Diaz had hunted them down and given them their choice, join us or die. A journalist wrote, "The meaning of the Porfirian dictatorship was that bands of wolves, instead of fighting each other, were now invited to unite in an attack on the sheep folds." These licensed robbers and killers brought to the impoverished, dispossessed Indian a tyranny unsurpassed even in the history of Mexico. The Indians formed 35% of the population, but so poor were they counted for nothing, socially or economically. Diaz regarded them as a hindrance to progress, to be kept in perpetual subjugation. The army, too, was kept under the dictator's iron heel. Its soldiers were, for the most part, sentenced to army service for civil crimes. They were ill-fed, badly clothed, rarely paid, and prey to the theft and brutality of their officers.
Our Century will continue in a moment on A&E. He now returns to the ragged revolution.
In those brilliant September days, as Diaz basked in the admiration of his foreign visitors, the bugles were about to sound. As the empty displays of the centenary celebrations unfolded, the first scattered shots could be heard that heralded the Mexican Revolution. Founder of the revolution was Francisco Madero, son of one of the wealthiest families in northern Mexico. Long a cautious critic of the Diaz regime, he had in 1909 toured Mexico on the first opposition speaking tour the country had known. The government soon stopped regarding Madero with amused tolerance. Too many jubilant crowds were flocking to hear him speak. He was arrested on a trumped-up charge and released on bail. He fled to Texas, and from there issued his revolutionary manifesto. In it, Madero promised free elections and reforms to follow. The men who joined him were to win the revolution in the end. Pascual Orozco, freight porter, mule driver, storekeeper, and general of a revolutionary army about to be formed. Pancho Villa, described as a mixture of Attila, Robin Hood, and Jesse James, a man of immense bravery, unspeakable cruelty. These two men secretly recruited their supporters, 500 here, 1,000 there. Short of money, short of arms, they nevertheless made headway. The dandy Emiliano Zapata joined them to fight mercilessly for the rights of the poor. Peasants flocked to his cry, "It is better to die on your feet than live on your knees." By the end of 1910, armies were forming throughout Mexico. Reluctant federal soldiers bade farewell to their wives and marched away to fight the very men who promised to achieve their innermost dreams: freedom from the tyranny of Diaz and his corrupt henchman. In skirmish after skirmish, the inefficiency of the federal army was revealed for all to see. Alarmed at the prospect of Diaz being unable to control the rebellion, President Taft ordered 20,000 American troops, a quarter of his army, to the Mexican border. Taft was not at this moment planning intervention, but he explained that in the event of the death or overthrow of Diaz, anarchy and the wholesale destruction of American property would inevitably follow. The United States troops had been instructed to take whatever action they saw fit to prevent such a calamity, even if it meant crossing the border to do so. The presence of this huge and well-equipped army on his borders distressed and humiliated Diaz. His government made nervous protests to the American government, but to no avail. The Americans were there to stay on routine maneuvers. In the Federal Army camps, morale slumped. Diaz could no longer depend on them for his defense. By their hundreds, they deserted, tore off their insignia and went home, or joined the rebel forces. Gradually, the flames of revolt licked at Mexico City itself. Crowds appeared in the streets carrying banners. "Long live Madero! Long live the revolution!" In the rioting that followed, between 50 and 80 people were killed. Secret talks had opened between Madero and government leaders. Madero's demand was concise: Diaz must resign. Federal troops restored order in the city, but in the north and south, battle after battle was being lost by their fellow soldiers. By the 25th of May, 1911, several major towns in the north and the state of Morelos, together with other state capitals in the south, had been captured and were now in rebel hands. For Diaz, it was all over. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, stricken with toothache, he signed a statement of resignation. And 34 years of his tyrannical rule were at an end. Amid the wildest jubilation Mexico City had ever seen, a triumphant revolutionary army marched in. In less than 8 months, the ragged, ill-disciplined and under-equipped soldiers of Villa, Zapata and Orozco had, with incredible ease, toppled a regime that had, at the independence celebrations, seemed so secure. Exultant people lined the streets. They cheered, drank tequila, and wept with the joy of liberation. A miracle had happened. And the man who had wrought the miracle, Francisco Madero, who now set out from the north on an historic journey to the nation's capital. His people, the illiterate, the voiceless, and the oppressed, poured by their thousands into the sun-baked streets. They hailed Madero as their savior, as an apostle, as the man who would transform their world. Observers who witnessed their almost religious fervor were troubled by it. They were expecting too much. Madero was a mild, well-intentioned man. His revolution carried none of the high purpose the people believed. His mission was limited mainly to the institution of free elections without re-election and the introduction of younger men into the government. As Madero's coach, resplendent with the trappings of the regime he had supplanted, passed by, the thronging crowd chanted, "Who wins?" Back came the answering roar, "Madero!" Immensely relieved at the turn of events, the American ambassador in Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, sent a message to President Taft. All dangers of anarchy in the city of Mexico have passed away, he said, but added darkly, "I am not so confident concerning conditions in the outlying parts of the Republic." As the crowds cheered on, Mexico entered one of the saddest and darkest periods of its history. For now, Madero had to introduce policies which would satisfy the expectant people, and do so quickly. As provisional president, Madero had appointed Francisco de la Barra, a former Mexican ambassador in Washington. It was a bad choice. Though acclaimed by the people, de la Barra remained at heart a Diaz man, and formed an interim government reluctantly. At its first meeting, he announced he would not be happy until he could give up the post. De la Barra had been described as a marshmallow, made up to look like a man, more concerned with his personal appearance than with the grim business of combating popular will. Hardly had he taken office than de la Barra ordered the immediate disbandment of the rebel armies that had overthrown the Diaz regime. He proposed leaving the country in the hands of a picturesque regular army, which had just proved conclusively its inability to defend it. Through the cheers, a distant rumbling of discontent grew ominously. In the south, Zapata refused to send his army home until his cherished dream of land reforms had been fulfilled. Madero traveled south to see him, watched the ragged army parade in an impressive show of strength, and promised partial reform. Zapata threw a great banquet in his honor, but de la Barra repudiated the agreement, and Zapata's men prepared to fight.
Our century will continue in a moment. Revolution.
In November, Madero was elected president. He rode in state to the General Assembly. He still had the support and goodwill of the masses, but around him grew a daunting wall of antagonism. His was the dilemma, common to all moderate revolutionaries. Supporters of the old regime had found places in the new government. Federal army officers, landowners and the church had survived the revolution with their power intact. The big business interests implacably opposed him, and their unofficial leader, Henry Lane Wilson, the American ambassador, persistently harassed the new administration. As the pageant of the installation of their new president unfolded, Mexicans began to see too much remaining of what they felt the revolution should have swept away. Madero himself failed to fit the image they had come to expect of a revolutionary president. Because he had failed to grapple with the problem of distribution of the land to those that tilled it, peasants began to label him as Judas. Revolutionary leaders were soon in open rebellion against him. First Zapata, then Pascual Orozco, who claimed Madero was betraying the revolution. Orozco had long been unhappy over his share of the spoils from the revolution. He had expected 250,000 pesos and a place in Madero's cabinet. He defected with 6,000 troops and vast quantities of military supplies. From his headquarters set up in Chihuahua, he warned Madero that he would soon be in Mexico City. The Federal Army, once the tool of Diaz, now that of Madero, set off northwards to meet the new challenge. In command, General Huerta. Orozco's army fell back, blowing up the railway tracks as they went. Doggedly, Huerta repaired the lines and carried on his pursuit. Huerta was a good soldier. Pancho Villa, who disliked him, said admiringly, "If his judgment is at fault, it is only because he begins to drink by 7 in the morning and is hardly ever at his best. He drinks morning, noon and night. His talents must be very great." Huerta disliked Villa too, finding him violent and undisciplined. He ordered his arrest for insubordination and sent him before a firing squad. Villa argued with the sergeant of the squad, "Why are they going to shoot me? I have served the government faithfully." Tears choked the old bandit, but he continued to play for time. Villa was actually against the wall, about to be shot, when Madero's reprieve overruling Huerta arrived. The incident closed, Huerta resumed his pursuit of Orozco. The rebels destroyed the vital railway track as they retired, and Huerta used captured prisoners as laborers to repair it. Through day after day, men sweated under the broiling sun, slaving until the troop trains could once more rumble through to the north. After several indecisive battles, Huerta's Federal Army met Orozco's rebels outside Chihuahua. Orozco had been reinforced and well supplied with arms smuggled across the American border. Throughout the day, the Federal Army pounded Orozco's positions and in assault after assault finally smashed the rebellion. Orozco fled into the United States, and his uprising was over. In triumph, Huerta entered Chihuahua City. He had won for himself a nickname, Mexico's Cromwell. But the victory did not end Madero's troubles. During the spring and summer of 1912, violence and destruction, murder and robbery flourished. By August, Ambassador Lane Wilson was losing all patience with Madero. Whatever his policy, he wrote, the situation remains the same. Growing crops are destroyed, homes are burnt, women are ravished, and wholesale murders take place. Pressure upon President Taft to intervene increased, but he resisted widespread demands for war with Mexico. No one with a sense of responsibility, he declared, would involve the American people in the almost unending burden and thankless task of imposing peace upon these 15 million people fighting among themselves. In February 1913, fighting broke out again. This time in Mexico City itself. Felix Diaz, nephew of the deposed dictator, had barricaded himself with rebellious troops in a military barracks a few blocks from the National Palace. Madero ordered General Huerta to oust them. For 10 days, Huerta and Diaz blasted each other with artillery. The Daily Mail reported many people have been killed in the fighting, and dead civilians are piled up in ghastly heaps in the streets. The city was paralyzed. All water and lights were cut off. On the 9th day, Ambassador Wilson wired Washington. Huerta notifies me to expect some action that will remove Madero from power at any moment. The next day, Madero was arrested by generals loyal to Huerta. 4 days later, he was driven towards the city penitentiary, where he had been told he would be safer, but he never arrived. He was gunned down in the car that carried him, and he died on this spot, the founder of the revolution, betrayed by those who could not wait. An American historian has written, in Mexican annals, the name of the United States Ambassador Wilson will ever be remembered for his important part in this affair. Wilson had arranged a secret meeting between the contending generals, Huerta and Diaz. They came to terms. Then they arrested Madero. It does little good for historians to demonstrate that Wilson was acting upon his own and not under orders from the State Department. Madero's murder shocked a world somewhat unaware of events in Mexico. It also rekindled the spark of the Mexican Revolution.
Our Century will continue in a moment on A&E. To the Ragged Revolution.
Leadership of the anti-Huerta rebellion was assumed by Venustiano Carranza. He appealed to the American president. I am certain that your excellency and your successor will not accept the spurious government which Huerta is attempting to establish. Taft's successor, Woodrow Wilson, was inaugurated within a week. He stated his policy without mentioning Mexico, but its meaning was clear. Just government rests always upon the consent of the governed. We can have no sympathy with those who seek to seize the power of government to advance their own personal interest or ambition. Back came Pancho Villa, determined as Carranza to make war on Huerta. Battle after battle flared up, until Mexico was ablaze with bloody conflict. Alarm grew in America. To prevent German munitions from being delivered to Huerta, President Wilson ordered troops into Veracruz. As the United States Marines came ashore, the American press asked, by what right has a president of the United States to say who shall and who shall not be president of Mexico? Carranza protested at America's interference in his nation's affairs. The invasion of our territory may drag us into an unequal war, he warned. Wilson, alarmed, mobilized his regular army of 54,000 men and the National Guard of 150,000. Tension mounted, and American troops massed along the border with Mexico.
Over here. Outside.
The wife of an American diplomat in Mexico wrote to her mother, I think we have done a great wrong to the Mexican people. Instead of cutting out the sores with a clean, strong knife of war, we have only put our fingers in each festering wound and inflamed it further. What we are doing is war accompanied by all the iniquitous results of half measures. Pressure against Huerta mounted. Everywhere, men intent upon avenging the death of Madero banded together or joined the rebel armies of chieftains like Pancho Villa or Alvaro Obregón. Mexico was on the march again. In July 1914, the revolutionaries under Carranza won a series of military victories, and Huerta was driven from Mexico. Now it was Carranza's turn to enter the city of Mexico in triumph. Again the people cheered. Again they hailed a military dictator as their savior. But now the hard-pressed populace yearned for an end to the strife that had ravaged their country and their lives for so long. In almost 4 years of fighting, the revolution had so far produced no program, no movement towards reform, no principle, no change by which the people could feel themselves protected from chaos, poverty, or tyranny. And none could really believe Carranza was the man to achieve it. By October, Pancho Villa was on the march again. This time, his army was closing on Mexico City itself. Carranza fled, and Pancho Villa entered the city on the 6th of December. He wrote, "The people of the city welcomed us with the greatest enthusiasm and affection. How the young ladies showered us with their flowers." The military crises precipitated by Villa's growing strength and capture of Mexico City forced Carranza to seek popular support. He turned, at last, to those to whom the revolution meant more than political or military campaigns, but a social movement. On January the 6th, 1915, he issued the first decrees that gave people hope. Decrees which were to be embodied and amplified in the Constitution of 1917, the Constitution upon which Mexican government today is based. Thus, unwittingly, Mexico's most improbable idol, Pancho Villa, a ruthless murderer, unscrupulous bandit, robber and illiterate, played his extraordinary part in the salvation of Mexico. He paid a visit to Madero's tomb and stood, shaggy, unshaven, easily moved to tears. Of Madero, someone had said, "He is an apostle, but he has deceived us all. He doesn't know how to use cold steel. He doesn't shoot. Do you believe that a president that doesn't shoot, who doesn't punish, who doesn't make himself feared, who always invokes laws and principles, can preside? Madero is good, but it's not a good man that is needed." Pancho Villa had been Madero's ideal ally, and of all the revolutionary leaders, he alone had remained faithful to its founder throughout. There were to be years more of fighting. Years more of pillage and rape. Years more of frightened women and children seeking the shelter of American trenches on their border, while rebel armies fought it out in the towns and villages that had once been their homes. There were to be American casualties from flying bullets, American forces having to withdraw because of the intensity of the battle across the Rio Grande. Punitive expeditions by American forces hunting down the elusive Pancho Villa. There were to be years of assassination and murder. Firing squads, the hangman's rope. Armies were to march across the tortured soil of Mexico for 5 more years before President Obregón brought fitful peace and the frescoes. But with the promise of democracy, of land to the tiller, of an end to tyranny and dictatorship and chaos, it needed only patience and survival before better days.
Next on A&E, the best in independent filmmaking on short stories. A college professor is challenged by a demanding student in Mortimer Griffin and Shilinsky.
Alvaro Obregón was really the first president of Mexico to embrace the revolution and its ideals. And after 10 years of chaos, he brought more than peace. He established the first proper mechanism for land reform and strengthened the trade union movement. He had the support of the army and the masses and was able to make peace with Zapata's followers. Unfortunately, the calm was short-lived. By 1923, Mexico was again thrown into civil war and Obregón assassinated 5 years later. But the revolution endured and changed Mexico forever. I'm Edward Herman for the A&E Cable Network and Our Century.